Surprise! I know I said I'd be back in 2 weeks, but I have a quick unscheduled episode that's kind of time sensitive, so I wanted to sneak it in the feed here. The short explanation is there's a book on Kickstarter right now that I really want to read. The long explanation, well, let's just go to the interview. Welcome back to the show. I have a special interview lined up today. I have with me Ben Zotto, who is currently going through a Kickstarter campaign to publish his book, Go Compute Now. So, Ben, welcome to the show. Would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
I will. Sean, it's nice to see you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I enjoy your podcast greatly, and this is absolutely the right place for me to be talking about the research work I've been doing.
Couldn't agree more.
Excellent. I am a researcher and writer, and have been at times a bit of a freelance journalist. I'm sometimes a type designer. I do a whole bunch of things, but what I'm here to talk about is uh, a few years worth of research I've done on a relatively obscure, relatively unloved computer platform that I have been convinced that is very important for the history of early microcomputers, and is a story that has sort of fallen through the cracks of history. I want to restore it to what I think is its proper place. And as you alluded to, I have a Kickstarter running at the time we're speaking, in late October. It's running through the middle of November, and the book is called Go Computer Now, and it is about Sphere Corporation from Bountiful, Utah. So if your listeners are I think squarely in the sort of potential audience for a story like this, it happens right at this inflection point, or this moment where microcomputers begin to coalesce, but it's still within that 1975-77 kind of Cambrian explosion, where you get a bunch of weird and unusual things that eventually sort of shakes out. And Sphere existed just in this little sort of liminal space and time, and did early and important work. So
So,
that's what we're here to talk about.
yes, precisely. I guess the place to start then is what exactly was Sphere computers, because they don't
Yeah.
exist anymore, I assume.
No, no. Sphere was, in short, they were a microcomputer manufacturer. They were out of Bountiful, Utah, which is a small town just north of Salt Lake City,
That's
15,
such
20
a
minute
good
town.
name. That
It
is
is,
fantastic.
it is. Bountiful is the second pioneer settlement in Utah after Salt Lake City, and it's named after a place in the Book of Mormon. And it is it's a lovely place. I've been to visit as part of the research for the book. Sphere was, in short, it was a Motorola 6800 based microcomputer. It existed in, it was a modular system that existed in different configurations. It came as a kit, it came assembled, as was sort of the way at that time for a company like that. Uh, what was interesting about it was that it showed up very early in this microcomputer timeline, but it was not a lights and switches front panel machine. It was a integrated console, keyboard, screen, interactive built-in firmware system that was not that much more expensive than an Altair, and also showed up in 1975. So it was essentially the second. It was probably the first full, I guess you kind of the first full microcomputer
Mhm.
based on the 6800. There weren't terribly many of them, but it was sort of the first of them.
Well, now
Uh,
MITS did a 6800 based computer also kind of in the same time period, right?
Yeah, they announced it. If
Oh,
you,
yeah.
yeah,
Announce versus shipped.
yeah, they announced in late 75, and they were feeling, according to Ed Roberts, the guy from MITS, in an interview, he was feeling pressure from both Southwest Technical and from Sphere, both of
Mhm.
whom had 6800 machines in the market at the end of 75. And I think the Altair 680, which was sort of a deliberately kind of hobbled machine,
Mhm.
appeared in the early months of 76. So Sphere shows up in October. It shows up in customers' hands in October of 75.
Mhm.
And it comes in, I say, different configurations, but it came with a keyboard. Every configuration would have a keyboard and a video output, just memory mapped video display board.
Mhm.
And so a hobbyist would maybe modify a television set or find a video monitor. If you bought an assembled version, it had an integrated case that had a display built in, and you would turn it on and you get a blinking cursor. And this was like
Yeah, that's
very
early.
different from like an Altair system. So it had built in, it had a 1K firmware ROM, which had a debugger, a cursor-based full screen editor, a little built-in mini assembler, as well as some math routines kind of built in. So it was like in this sense, it was leagues beyond what you would get if you purchased an Altair kit, which was
I mean,
the kind of the only competitor at the time.
yeah, and having 1K of anything in 1975 at the consumer level, that's a
Mhm.
lot.
And yeah, that's in the ROM. It had 4K of RAM,
Wow.
which was astonishing in
Yeah,
1975.
that you can run basic in that.
You can you can run basic, but the sort of the one of the reasons why we largely haven't heard of Sphere is they came out of the gate with this very strong offering, and then kind of couldn't keep up with uh they couldn't keep up with customer needs and really with the market. So where MITS had this what became the Microsoft Basic, which was in the gold standard of microcomputer basics and is actually an exceptional piece of software. Sphere took months and months to produce any kind of basic at all, and then it wasn't very good, and customers were not kind of sure what to do with that, and were stranded on this platform that was unlike the Altair S100 type machines, and so it didn't benefit from the third-party development that happened on those systems. So they came out of the gate with this incredibly strong setup. You could turn the thing on, you could start programming. It was designed by this guy named Mike Wise, who was 25, I think, when he founded the company in Bountiful, and a couple of his kind of friends and associates. And uh, Mike wasn't a hobbyist in the sense that those many early micro users in the United States kind of either bled over from ham radio or were kind of electronics hobbyists. Mike had he had done several years at that point of work in university and corporation or corporate settings where he was doing IBM System 360 work, DEC PDP work, like paid work. He wasn't like bumming time off of the computer at school. He was getting paid to put together complicated software systems. So when he foresaw a microcomputer, he didn't see, oh, I need a kind of a fun thing to tinker with. He was imagining like, how can I put something together that people can do real work with? And that was and then kind of scrambled to get that together and was able to. And that was sort of it was a very different product than anything else in the sort of Byte
Yeah,
magazine world for the first
especially
year.
given 75, that is just a little bit too early for like a polished, useful microcomputer to really be a thing in the market.
Hmm.
Because so many like the Altair, it's a lot closer to a toy than a fully functional computer. So it must have been wild. I can understand why MITS would feel pressure if someone else is on the market at what kind of price point was it? Was it similar at
It was
all?
yeah. I mean, it was what you'd call affordable to an individual,
Hmm.
right? Which was sort of that was kind of at this point in the history of these microcomputers, the prices were, you get the first microcomputer in the sense of a computer built around a
Hmm.
microprocessor happens in the sort of earlier parts of the 70s, but those are like they're $20,000. They're sold to, a credit union to use to do work with or whatever. But you start to get in 74 and 75 things that are kind of affordable to an individual. So the introductory price for the Sphere kit was $680, which was
Oh yeah, that's
maybe
that's
50%.
ballpark.
Yeah, it's maybe 50% more than the entry level Altair. But
Mhm.
the entry level Altair came with, depending on which price list you're looking at, either 0 bytes of RAM or 256 bytes of RAM. And
Again, closer to a toy than a computer, right?
Yeah, and and it came from this lineage. The MITs came from this lineage where they were selling calculator kits, and this was their big company saving effort. And they knew Les Solomon from Popular Electronics, and so they got it on the cover. And it met their needs, and the Altair unlocked this incredible like latent interest in like people wanting to own their own computer, like for themselves. But it wasn't certainly at the outset. The Altair was not something you would like get work done with in any sense of work. Eventually, of course, there were third parties and additional boards you could buy for it. You could configure it, and then you could get a terminal, and then later there was CPM, and it became a useful device. But what's so interesting to me about Sphere is that it shows up in 75 with this like fully formed idea. It it didn't always work super reliably. So one of the reasons why Sphere is not this world dominating computer brand name is they reached the market, and you need most of the customers of the most success were the ones who had a lot of experience with electronics work, and even to the extent of knowing their way around an oscilloscope. So that's like many early computer micro users would have this kind of hobbyist bent anyway. The spheres needed often a little bit of work. The company hardened them quite quickly, but maybe not enough. And so they ended up acquiring a reputation not entirely undeserved of being perhaps a bit unreliable, difficult to get around, difficult to get to work. The people who figured out how to get them stable and working and uh, and successful ended up using them successfully for, in many cases, years afterwards. They were good machines when you got them together, but they were they had the curse of being early as well as the blessing of being early.
Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like they fell into a bit of a pit, right? Because if, like, on the one end, you have companies that want computers and they're selling a polished computer that doesn't always work reliably, and on the other side, you have hobbyists who are very much up to get down and dirty, but they kind of want a machine that there's an expectation that you're going to get down and dirty.
Mhm.
And then you have this thing that kind of fits in between. That it seems like it would make sense the company could get a little lost.
I think that's an astute observation, and they have this. So Sphere was around from the company started work in the spring of 1975, got to market in October of 75,
That's fast.
and was it's actually remarkably fast, and then was entirely gone by May of 77.
Wow.
So, and Mike Wise, the founder, and
Mhm.
was acknowledged by everyone I talked to. So I've interviewed dozens of people for the book. I've interviewed pretty much everybody who is still alive that worked for Sphere, as well as a bunch of people in the user community and other kind of industry figures to kind of help me kind of contextualize. Mike himself died almost 25 years ago, so in some ways he is sort of this kind of genius visionary character who is the sort of like both the keystone and kind of the mystery at the center of the story. And I've done my best to present him as people remembered him to me. But he ends up leaving the company in the spring of 76. So he is like kind of so far ahead. He's like trying to do the next thing and the next thing. And he kind of sees that they're kind of going towards this pre-assembled, all built into one thing with basic built-in kind of home, what you call home computer. And so he wants to start where they start advertising for this thing called the microsphere early in 76. And it looks very much to look at the advertising. It's like, this is an Apple II. Like, this is what you've come up with. But they didn't build it. It was like they
Mhm.
had these sort of maybe some prototypes hardware, and they had this mock-up case, and they had advertising, but it didn't end up existing. But this tension occurs where Mike is trying to push forward, but they have these promises and commitments to existing customers. They're trying to ship stuff out the door. The tension reaches a head. Mike leaves. The company ends up to the point you made a moment ago. The company ends up trying to pivot or working to pivot to business solutions. So
Mhm.
they have people there, a couple of the executives who had come from really kind of traditional office equipment, sales, marketing, technology. And so they kind of say, well, these business use cases are like much better defined than what we've been trying to juggle. And so they kind of push in the direction of, can we do a packaged inventory program or a point of sale program, and so they start working on these. And I think so in some sense they were like a little almost too early with those, because the hardware wasn't really there yet, the
Mhm.
user understanding wasn't there yet, and the company kind of didn't make it long enough to really see that reach the market.
Well, and doing hardware and software as a first party at the same time is really, really difficult and really, really expensive in terms of like human investment
Yeah.
too. So
Yeah. And it's
that is shooting for the stars.
I mean, in a way, and it was so interesting, researching this era is so interesting because that's what everybody was doing. Everybody
Oh
was
yeah.
like reaching for the stars. Everybody, and you're like, well, we're gonna, their first factory was in a hamburger stand in Bountiful. They had rented this building that used to be Wally's Burger Bar, and they just they like drag in all their, they get desks from church sales and they put it all in there, and they got people soldering in the back where the cinder block back part of the building was. And and I have photos of this, and they're in the book, and it's like this was the state of the art of
That's
American
fantastic.
microcomputer manufacturing in 1975. And it's just like people with like a Fanta bottle in front of them, like doing like soldering stuff together. But they could, and they're,
Mhm.
they buy the parts from Motorola, they get the circuit board from somebody else, they get the parts from the guy down in Salt Lake City, and they put them together and ship them out, and that's a computer.
Yeah, that people in IT today talk a lot about, oh, we need to have teams that are scrappy, but today we ain't scrappy. That's scrappy. I really love that. So I have some technical questions.
Hit me.
You said Sphere was modular, kind of.
So Mike had spent time with the System 360, right? Which is this sort of
Mhm.
famously the sort of swap in and out configurable modular system. So he talked about Sphere as a modular system.
Ah.
And because I think he thought, okay, well, you can scale up and down,
Mhm.
plug in different parts. And so he described it as a suite of, so when they came to market with a series of, not a suite, a series of systems, and it was the hobbyist system, but then there's system there's a memory module that kind of goes into the system, and that expands your possibility. And then there was a serial board, and that is like the Swiss Army knife multi-configurable thing. You can have two tape cassette interfaces or a teletype interface and a RS-232 interface, or like TTL serial and like a bunch of other stuff that like, current loop over there. If you want it, you can configure that however you want. And then there's a parallel interface board, which was designed to go with a floppy disk system and a line printer system. So he was bringing
Mhm.
floppy disk stuff to microcomputers like from the get, in the sense that now, and other microsystems were also eventually figured out, 8-inch disks, right? Like
Yeah,
figured
but
out how to
later
attach.
on.
Yeah, and Mike was like there on like day one, he's calling up Motorola and saying like, who are your floppy partners? How do we get,
Mhm.
how can I get this thing plugged in to the thing that we're making? So he saw it as a configurations that scaled with kind of a discrete set of hardware parts that would be associated with each configuration. Of course, you can upgrade later, you can buy the board.
Mhm.
Um, that that suggests that plugging the boards in to each other was easy, but the boards were connected not through a backplane. Mike wanted to save money, lowest cost. It's
Mhm.
like, what we're going to do is we're going to have these ribbon cables. They're going to connect from board to board to board to board,
Oh
and
man.
there are going to be four of them, and that's the system bus. So, and they're not even mechanically locked. They're going to be plugged into dip plugs that go into dip sockets.
Oh
So each
no.
so each board, it was inexpensive. Like
Yeah, oh yeah,
it
that's a
is like
huge cost
you're
savings.
saving you don't have it's a whole, you're not, those the just S100 sockets are expensive. So he
Yeah.
says we can do this better. we're going to have 4 DIP sockets on every board in the same location, and we're going to ship with our system for customers this these wound up series of these ribbon cables, and you're going to plug them across all the boards that you have. And
And
if
you're
you get
not
a
going
new
to bend
board,
a single pin ever.
and you're not going to wiggle them and have the pins start wiggling out. Maybe just one data line, and then have to figure out. So it turns out in practice, this is a solution that has not been repeated by other companies, and
Oh,
for
you don't
good
say.
for good reason.
That
But
would be horrifying to try and debug. I have one data line that doesn't quite work.
yeah, and it's like it's plugged into like it's like wiggled slightly out 3 boards over, right? Is the
Ugh.
and uh and I have experienced this firsthand. I have a Sphere system, and I found it on the sidewalk. Somebody left it as dumped junk, and I scooped it up and brought it home and got it working. And I had to make these ribbon cables for it, and it is challenging. And I have lived that experience. But people would, users at the time, I've loved hearing the stories of people who say, well, we use a binder clip on these things to hold them, or we'd need to string a separate ground braid across all the boards to reduce noise and the signals. And it was this kind of like incredibly MacGyver creative user community like made this work. Sphere was planning on had improvements to that. Like very quickly
Mhm.
they understood that the ribbon cable thing was like not the right solution. But again, they're financing. There's this treadmill, right, that happens with especially these early micro companies. What happens is they put an ad out, or they get a newspaper, they get a magazine article in radio electronics or popular electronics. People start sending checks. This is not how this works anymore. People start sending checks, and people who only had an idea and enough money for an advertisement suddenly find that they have a computer company and they have customers, and now they owe people stuff. And so they have to very quickly invent the things that they said they were going to sell in the ad. So Sphere, like many companies operated this way in this like 75, 76, or like the pages of Byte and Rate full of companies that like just kind of throw their name out there, like, let's see if anybody sends us a check. And if people send checks, okay, we'll make it.
I,
So
I know exactly what you mean. I have a folder of clippings from Byte, not physical. It's
yeah.
online. I wouldn't cut that. But it's all ads for different Unixes. But it's
Uh,
like, oh, that doesn't sound real. I'll set that aside for later because I'm sure there's a fascinating story behind that.
yes, yes. And it turns out like I've traced down a couple of those rabbit holes just like this, and looking for peripherals and things, and like a whole bunch of stuff just wasn't real. It
Yeah.
turns out
Oh
like
yeah.
it just there was, you can find advertisement, you think, well, this company made this thing, and it's like, oh man, no, they might not have, and Sphere was real, and they made this stuff. What happens when you start a company that way and you don't have a lot of outside funding, and these guys didn't largely. So what you get enough cash in the door up front, you start your company and you hire some people, you rent a place, you buy the parts, you start building computers, you start shipping them. But now you need the next orders to pay for the orders you're still making, right? Because you spent up front on people and office space and equipment. And so you need to scale or change your business or take outside investment such that you can get to a point where you are able to make machines as people are ordering them. And
Mhm.
Sphere was never really able to get off that treadmill. And this gets to, the time. I don't, this may be something that you're familiar with through your research, but the venture capital community, certainly as we understand it today, but as we even understood it in the late 70s or early 80s, didn't really exist yet. And it
Mhm.
certainly didn't exist in Utah. So it like wouldn't have occurred to these folks to say, they might have thought about going to a bank to try to get a loan, but it would never have occurred to them to say, hey, we're a fast growing, technology hardware company. Can we have an infusion of cash so that we can get our computers out the door? And so it made it hard for them to it made it hard for they had this incredible thing on day one out the door, and it was very hard for them to push forward beyond that. They were so frantically catching up on what they had already kind of promised.
That that is funny you say maybe you ran into this in your research because I kind of avoid talking about VC funding
Mhm.
like the plague because it gets so complicated and convoluted so quickly. And especially like with Sphere, like with these early companies, where it's like, oh, if you look a little bit, there's either no funding
Mhm.
or the funding sources are so varied and confusing, or
Mhm.
it comes down to like, oh, it's just this guy that put in some money, but now I can't get a hold of him anymore. So the company's going under.
Yeah. Or, I mean, often it was friends and family. Like
Yeah.
they're taking money from friends and family. Sometimes employees are kicking in some bucks and getting
Mhm.
stock in return, right? People are working for equity. There's at least
Mhm.
one guy I talked to at Sphere who, he had a deal with Mike where he's gonna work at minimal pay in exchange for accumulating, which is a very modern concept, but it was really because the company didn't have that much, the company didn't have that much money to pay him.
Mhm.
Um, the VC stuff really kind of got going at the I'll recommend to you there's a good book. It's called VC in American History. It's Nichols, I think, is the guy who wrote it. And there's a chapter or section about Silicon Valley, and that kind of talks through a little bit about the origins of Sequoia and Kleiner Perkins and the people that ended up funding Apple and et cetera. And a difference is people have sort of said to me about Sphere, okay, so you're telling me they made this great thing. Like, why are they not Apple? Why is, what happened there? It's a great question. I mean, it's a great question and it's interesting. And
Well, it's a
one of
really
the,
hard question to answer.
it's a, and one of what, and there are many, it's a multi-factor question. One of the things that happens is Steve Jobs knows how to network his way to early venture capital in the Valley. And
Mhm.
their first product sold fewer units than the Sphere did. The Apple One sold, I don't know what, 200 something, 200, 300 units. And so it was by that measure, it was not a raging success. It was a modest product, but they knew they wanted to do something kind of bigger and better next, and they found their way to capital. And among the contrasts is Sphere kind of never really did that, and ended up just kind of strung out and effectively in debt, and was unable to not only was not able to do new product development. At some point, they couldn't even fill orders that had already come in.
Well, and there's also, I think, an aspect of luck in this period with a lot of these
Oh,
companies.
of
Like
course.
the Altair wouldn't have had BASIC if they were left to their own devices, right?
Or they certainly wouldn't have had a good one.
Yes,
And
yes,
that
correct.
is, yeah, I mean, and it strikes me, I have an engineering background, and doing this research project, I mean, I have such renewed respect for Gates and Allen. Like their thing emerges like almost fully formed out of the head of
Mhm.
like this college kid and his buddy in like early mid 1975. And it's so good that it is effectively the lingua franca of microcomputers for the next 15 years.
Yeah.
And like there are other reasons. There's luck, there's other reasons why that happened, of course, right? These things are always complicated, but there's no question that like the product was good. Like the basic was great. And there's so much luck that goes on, obviously, that kind of goes on through these stories.
All right. Another technical question.
Hit me.
Why the 6800? I think that's kind of the elephant in the room, right? Is we have the 6800 computer. There weren't that many other 6800 computers. So why did Sphere build around that and not the Z80 or the 8080 or some more pedestrian chip?
So it's fun. It's so interesting to me to hear your perspective, to hear the way that you frame that. Uh, the Because I think the Motorola team would have thought their chip was just as functional and pedestrian as the Intel's chip. So
Well, again, we have the power of hindsight,
we do, we
so
do.
that I think casts a different image on a lot of the field.
So the 6800 was brand new,
Mhm.
and Sphere. was probably the first kind of what you would call a microcomputer, as opposed to a trainer board or
Yeah.
a set of thing from Motorola themselves. Sphere was the first kind of computer built around the 6800, and and at the time, the only other microcomputer of that chip generation that existed was the Altair. And so I don't think Mike Wise and his associates were thinking we're going to go with this quirky otherworldly thing. I think for them it was a here's the new, and we looked at the architecture, and the 6800 architecture is very elegant, especially
Mhm.
relative to the 8080, which still had baggage from the 8008 injected in it, right? It was all, it was a single voltage chip. It ran at a slightly slower clock speed, but its instruction set was easier to learn. And I
Mhm.
think Mike was an engineer. The people he was working with, especially early on, were engineers, and they looked at the documentation and they thought, okay, this is the more elegant chip. And at the time there was no other. It was, you could pick, I guess you could choose to pick the same one that the Altair had for whatever reason, but they picked the other one.
All
And
right. You got me. You got me.
and they yeah, I mean this is before the Z80, it's before the 6502. It was really just of that chip generation. There was Intel, who was now on their third generation of chip. They had the 4004, the 8008, and they'd come out with the 8080. And Motorola had started with the 6800 generation. It surprised Intel because Intel didn't realize that the competition was coming from that direction. And I think my understanding from some interviews I did was that Mike also believed that because there wasn't a lot of existing hardware at that moment. It was very early anyway, around the 6800, that they would have maybe a better relationship with Motorola as a result. Like that maybe they could get
Mhm.
more, maybe they'd get maybe a better deal on the chip, so they'd get more better documentation, or maybe Motorola would kind of do some marketing for them, or kind of turn around and tell people to go check out this Sphere thing because they were kind of the first exemplar of a
Yeah,
system built around it.
now that's really an interesting perspective to have.
Yeah, I am. It didn't, in my understanding, and this is hard, right? This history is 50 years old, and I'm doing a lot of primary source work, so it's like memories are very understandably fuzzy. People, if there were notes, they're long gone, right?
Mhm.
Like it's kind of tricky. I don't I don't think that they ended up getting a particularly great deal on the chips. I don't think Motorola gave them any particular marketing assistance, is my sense. Motorola did help them, or at least kind of help them connect on a deal to figure out their floppy disk situation, because Motorola had a development line of, as Intel did too. They had their Exorciser system, which was like their go figure out how to build your own hardware. So they had thought about some of these problems, and I think they were willing to offer some insight to the Sphere team. But my sense is that they didn't really get maybe more than that from Motorola, but they ended up with the 6800 and kind of went from there. And I think clearly in hindsight, that was a very isolating decision. There really was not the industry, such as it was, very quickly coalesced around the Intel platform. The 6800 systems existed, but mostly ended up descending from the Southwest Technical product, and looking more like that, or being cross compatible with that. And the Sphere just kind of ended up on its own as a hardware architecture, and as a result, kind of a software architecture. And because they sold over 1,000 systems, probably not as many as 1,500, no real way to be sure. But because they didn't create an enormous amount more traction, then there was no virtuous cycle of people building third party, processor technology didn't come in and say, well, we'd love to do a set of expansion boards for the Sphere. No, like it's the Altair's the market, and then the Imzai is the same. So great, now it's all those customers. And that kind of took off and was successful. So, but that's a luck timing, hindsight kind of decision that I
Yeah.
think I think in retrospect, I'm sure if Mike were analyzing in retrospect, he'd be like, yeah, maybe we should have picked a different architecture. But I think in March of 1975, I don't think it would have been particularly obvious that the Intel platform was any more of anything than the Motorola
Mhm.
platform was.
Very neat. Yeah, that again, like I said, you got me. I wasn't thinking about the fact that you just wouldn't know, especially that early on. That's really cool. Something else you mentioned to me that you haven't brought up in the interview yet is track.
Hmm.
Of
Yeah.
course, we all know track, the best programming language ever developed by Calvin Moores.
Text reckoning and compiling.
So track.
So track. uh Track, you did, and I'm sure you can insert or link to, you did a whole episode about track. It is a fascinating sort of cul-de-sac a little bit in programming languages. And I was so interested to note that you had done that because and this is kind, I mean, it's in the weeds on the Sphere story, but it's interesting. One of the things that Mike and the main software engineer, a guy named Eric Jameson, were working on in mid 76 was a version of track, like to build into the firmware for Sphere. So they had this idea. And the idea was we should stay on top of being unique, being having a
Mhm.
value proposition that is distinct. And the belief was track is this, it's the belief was, and this is, Ted Nelson agrees with this, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but that it is like a easy to learn for beginners. It's one of these, if you've never touched a computer before, this will make sense to you. But if you've done programming before,
It
like
won't.
it's going to mess with your head. And people say that about various languages. And I'm tainted. I'm a computer programmer, so it doesn't make that much sense to me. It makes sense to me, but it doesn't strike me as something that would be easy for someone who was new to computing to learn. But these early, though, track, I think, and you can correct me here if I'm not right. I think that track, in similar to Forth, has this like kind of low overhead runtime system where you can kind of like, it'll kind of build tokens above a base set of functions or whatever methods or whatever their
Kind
little
of.
fragments.
So track could be really low memory footprint because it's all macro replacements.
Yeah,
So there aren't really like built-in functions. All the built-in functions are for string composition.
right.
But that means that the code is very memory intensive because
Mm,
you have to write such large software to do anything that's normal. Like you can't do mathematics normally with track
yeah.
because it's
Uh,
string macro replacement.
yeah.
It's not for programmers. It's not for us.
Right. It's not for us.
And I
I
think implementations are also, in theory, kind of CPU heavy because you're doing string reckoning the whole time.
Yeah.
But the actual compiler for it, well, compiler, it's like a weird just in time
Mm,
macro
yeah.
engine. Um, isn't that big in memory.
Yeah.
So there's that.
So maybe it's a small amount of ROM firmware,
Yeah,
you
that makes
be
sense.
a
I
little
can buy
be a
that.
little generous with your RAM, I guess. Yeah, I find Forth really interesting in this context. In the Forth was popular in the early micros because it's very low overhead for what it is. It's this very kind of clever sort of immediate
Mhm.
linked compiled fragments thing. And in my head, track has sort of like a similar runtime structure. I'm not sure, and I don't, whether that was a good idea for Sphere to dive into or not. I can't say. Eventually, Mike had left, new management showed up, and it didn't make the cut for
Mhm.
what they were going to work on going forward. So it didn't go anywhere, as far as I know. But to my understanding, there was at least one guy who was actively working on it as
I
as a as a
wonder.
differentiator.
I wonder if they just read computer lib Dream Machines and got like just super interested in it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that was a very widely read book
Yeah.
among that set, right?
Now you probably don't know the answer to this question, but did they license track?
I do not know the answer to that
Okay.
question. It is
Calvin
it is
Moore's
I know,
was
very he
notorious, yes,
yes, he would
litigious.
would want you, it would have to be licensed. And whether it was or not, or had even reached that point yet or not, I don't know. But
Gotcha.
I thought it was it's a very interesting little bit of trivia that, you had this microcomputer company in Utah that was sort of trying to be different, where everybody was doing, okay, we're doing the Intel 8080 assembler, and we're doing the Altair Basic. You have Sphere, they're working on maybe doing track, like before they even really have a great
Mhm.
basic out. And which is also like I mean, if you're trying to be differentiated, like it's an interesting way to go.
That does at least to me, that does kind of make sense because you're saying that Spheres came out the gate with an interactive text prompt, and Track is literally all about having an interactive text prompt.
Hmm.
So like I can see the connection.
Yeah. I, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, they had a cursor controlled memory mapped full screen text editor built into ROM in October of 1975,
That's wild.
I mean, the memory mapped text displays became absolutely the standard hardware approach to console displays starting like a year after that, and then like
That's
forevermore
so
for
cool.
years. But
Yeah.
really prior to that is the assumption was you would have a computer, which was a big rectangle, and then you'd have a teletype or equivalent. You have a video terminal, or you'd have an ASR33, or you'd have something that would allow you to like have a serial connection into the computer, right? Like the computer looked like a DEC mini computer, but it was like it had this minuscule potato chip CPU,
Mhm.
but you have this console that you have this terminal to interact with it. And Sphere just threw that out the window. They took the TV typewriter concept. Are you familiar with this?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So they took the TV typewriter, which to me is this very hard. It's so hard to understand from any later perspective, like why this was like an interesting idea. Like, and yet it was a rage, right? People were so excited about the fact that on their television they could put letters, and that was like nearly the entire concept. Like you have to do all this work. It's complicated. It's expensive. It's like 6 PCBs. And at the end, it's like you type some words and like, look, they're there in the living room on the TV set. Like, look at it. Like they're the words I typed. They're right there. And it was this sort of thread running in the background of the hobbyist community. Southwest Technical produced a version of it in late 74, early 75, that they started selling as like a terminal kit. And it was like that was like they had a serial terminal kind of wedged onto a TV typewriter circuit. And they started selling that as like an inexpensive do build it yourself terminal. What Sphere did, but of course, and the way that they always published, Southwest Technical published their stuff in radio electronics, right? So they published construction guides and stuff. This was very typical at the time. The way that they would get the word out is they would call up the editor and say, we got this new product. So what we're going to do is I'm going to write an article for you, the magazine. It's going to be content for your magazine. And then I'm going to say, if you want to buy the kit, write to this address. Or you can screen the PCBs yourself and you can buy the parts yourself. But of course, like not many people do that, right?
Mhm.
So Southwest Technical puts out this terminal and then puts out a series of articles describing the circuitry of the terminal. The hardware guy at Sphere, a guy named Monroe Tyler, basically says, well, what if instead of the terminal, I just bolt on the data bus into it? So rather than having a serial connection and a bunch of counters and a cursor control hardware, I just open it up to the system bus and I memory map that video, and then it'll just show up on the screen.
Yeah, you got
And
it. It's
and
done.
and that's what he does. And he takes almost this, like he takes that circuit, like the Southwest Technical circuit, and the Sphere's video board is like a clone of like a chunk of the Southwest Technical circuit, and then like the left half of it is like the part that's bolted onto the system bus.
That's so
And
neat.
so it doesn't work like all that well because
Mhm.
it doesn't broker the access to the video RAM. So it's like every time the system reads or writes from the video RAM, you get snow on the screen because it interrupts the video refresh. But it works. And it's like it's expedient, it's scrappy, and they get it out the door, and like they're the first, they're the first memory mapped cursor. They've arrow keys on the keyboard, and you can move the cursor around. You can delete stuff, move stuff around, and this is like everybody else was using terminals for the next 18 months at least before memory map videos become like a de facto standard in the micro world. But Sphere like roars out of the gate with this memory map video thing, and you're editing your assembly code right there on the screen. You go up a line, down a line, scroll it up and down, whatever. Like it's amazing.
That's it's just such a fascinating computer, and I'm really excited to read about the whole story once the book's out.
I I I have done this. I mentioned that I had sort of literally stumbled over a Sphere computer on the sidewalk a few years ago, and that began this kind of journey for me. It started as a restoration project. I was like, well, I'm going to figure out, yeah, tinker around, I'll figure something out, I'll watch some YouTube videos, I'll figure out how to make this thing work. And then I realized like it doesn't then I'm like, this seems really cool. Like this seems really interesting and very early for what it's doing. And like, why hasn't anybody heard of this thing? And so it started as a search for parts. So I start sending letters to people who were on the user list from 1979 to see if anybody has like a keyboard, because like it didn't have a keyboard. But then it very quickly turns into just like, tell me about your experience with this computer. They're like, this thing was, I got it because I would never have had an Altair. Like an Altair, who wants to deal with the switches? I wanted a thing that worked like a computer, and that's why I got a Sphere, And and that begat conversations with seeking out people who worked at the company, led the company, went to Bountiful, spent a bunch of time in the Computer Museum archives. So it's an immense amount of work. I'm circling around it. I'm glad you're looking forward to reading it. I'm very proud to have been able to write it. I feel like this bunch of people, I feel like I kind of I realize that history is written by the successes, but it's also written by people who talk about their accomplishments, even those who didn't necessarily succeed. Silicon Valley has this ethos where failures are in some ways can be spun as successes. It's experience, it gets parlayed into your next project. Sphere was like not, it didn't, the the folks who made the Sphere were largely men of faith in the LDS church. They felt bad that the computer didn't work, right? The company didn't work, and the computer was not successful. And then they kind of went on to other jobs, and they didn't talk about it as, isn't this amazing, this stuff that we did? And they went on to the rest of their lives. And because none of them kind of went back into the Silicon Valley firmament and threaded back through later stories, it just kind of like it fell through all the cracks. And so by the time the early micro histories were being written in the early mid 80s, like Fire in the Valley, Michael Moritz did The Little Kingdom. There are like a number of really great books that come out in like 1984, 83, 85 that kind of capture, but Stephen Levy's Hackers kind of capture this era. Sphere had already sort of become like a footnote at best by then. And then that was kind of how those narratives kind of became coalesced and became encoded in our computing history. And so I sort of saw this as an opportunity to put Sphere back into its rightful place in this early micro history. They didn't sell millions of units, the company disappeared, but they were very early with some important pieces of technology. The people were interesting. The story of the company is interesting. And some of the users then went on and did other important things. People who cut their teeth on the Sphere went on to found adventure game companies and early word processors on other platforms. And Sphere kind of begat one of the very early micro software publishers and distributors, which just emerged because that guy was a Sphere owner and he got mad that Sphere was disappearing and he wanted to do something about it. And all these stories are in the book, and I'm glad you're looking for. It was such a pleasure to write it and to learn from all these people, and I learned a ton myself that I didn't know. And I'm hopeful that that many people will find the story interesting. I hope it will kind of correct a record or will challenge some narratives that exist. If somebody, one of your listeners, say, is very loves the older stuff, because I know you talk a lot about the pre-micro stuff, but is like has not spent a lot of time in the early micro era. I also tell the story against the backdrop of the existing story. So you kind of find out how Steve Wozniak and Bill Gates thread through this era as well. And they all show up, they all get together in Kansas City to figure out, not Wozniak, but Gates and the Sphere guys, they all get together to figure out how to do the cassette data standard, and then like that all happens, they're all there in the same hotel conference room. Sphere shows up at these Sphere demonstrates the homebrew club, and Wozniak watches the Sphere demo, and like he kind of goes home and finishes work on his Apple One. And it's like it kind of even if you don't want to buy the case that there was like a maybe a direct influence there, certainly they were in the arena there with these other figures who we've heard about for many, many years. And seeing putting them back into that story and picture, I think has been really interesting. And I think it's important for Sphere. I think it's interesting for people it's interesting. It's new stuff that has sort of it disappeared, and I've sort of dragged it back out into the light is the
Good.
idea.
I love the enthusiasm, and that is exactly what needs to get done for so many of these old stories. So again, I'm very much looking forward to the book. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can find the Kickstarter, and I'll link to it too.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate your enthusiasm. I can get a little carried away. I love talking about it, and I can talk about it forever. So if you find it interesting too, there's a book, with your name on it. The book is called Go Computer Now. The name is taken from one of the Sphere ads. I loved it as like a sort of like non-grammatical, but like
Yeah,
very charming, like Go Computer Now. And so that's the name of the book. It's on Kickstarter fundraising for the first print run. I'm doing a nice like a hardcover. I'm doing it like for real. It's a hardcover book. It's got the full endnotes and the index and the whole nine. It's being designed by somebody whose work I really love. I'm trying to get a bunch of great photos and ephemera and other. I've pulled out some stuff out of the archives and some photos that people have given me that no one's ever seen before. Early micro era photos, great. You can get it on Kickstarter. You can search for Go Computer Now. I think Sean will probably put a link there.
Mhm.
It'll be up through November 13th as a crowdfunding campaign. Assuming that that succeeds. If you are listening to this after that, please still go. You can go to gocomputernow.com. That's my little landing page for the book, and there will be a way to get it after that date as well. So if you're listening to this and would like to support the first print run, we have not made the goal yet, but I hope to and plan to, and with the help of anybody that would like to contribute, there's also like there's some cool extras, mugs, and kind of fun stuff that part of the Kickstarter. But search on Kickstarter for Ghost Computer Now. Go to gocomputernow.com and you'll find it.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, Ben.
John, thank you. It is always a pleasure to talk about this. It's a pleasure to chat about it with you. Thank you.